I think we're good. So I'll just start at the beginning. As Karen mentioned, my name is Jacob Woulf. I'll go over some different methods for advanced tracking or advanced techniques for wildlife tracking. My current role is Motus coordinator for Lake Michigan Bird Observatory. The Motus wildlife tracking system is a very specialized system for primarily bird tracking, but it also includes organisms such as reptiles, amphibians, insects, you name it, it's been tagged. But first we'll kind of start off broad. We'll go over various tracking techniques, and then we'll end with Motus, the work that I'm working on for the Motus wildlife tracking system, and then kind of the details along with that. So starting off again with a little bit of background about me. I went to UW Green Bay for quite a while. I earned a bachelor's degree in 2019 in animal biology. And after I finished that, I continued the following year towards a master's in environmental science and policy. I graduated there in 2022. Now, in that role as a grad student, I worked primarily with double-crested cormorants, but in general, piscivorous or fish-eating birds, and tracking their movements across lower Green Bay. But after I graduated, I stayed on for another year and also included American white pelicans in that project as well. Both of those birds obviously can consume quite a large number of fish. And with the colonies being in the thousands of birds, there was local interest, there was federal interest just to see where these birds are going and what they are consuming. It led nicely into my current role, which is Motus coordinator for Lake Michigan Bird Observatory, and I've been in that role for just over a year, since January of 2023. Most people are probably familiar with different methods of wildlife tracking. There are really kind of limitless ways that people can track wildlife, or in this case, birds, but kind of a few categories that people think of when we're talking about bird tracking is bird banding, radar, which is a new technology that people have been using for tracking migratory movements, GPS transmitters, which are extremely detailed, gives us detailed locations and time, and then the Motus wildlife tracking system, which is that specialized system for small migratory birds. So looking at banding, a lot of people are probably familiar with banding because it has been around for quite a while. It's an old method, it's well known and often used. Throughout the course of the year, there are tens of thousands of birds that are banded. With something being so readily or so easily able to catch birds and to attach bands to them, there are definitely some limitations with banding birds. For those who don't know, these birds that are banded, they're often caught in mist nets. And once they are extracted from these nets, several measurements are taken, such as wing cord length, tail length, weight. And after that, the bird is given a small aluminum band that has a unique number. So if this bird happens to be caught by another bander, they can type in that number to the bird banding lab and report that, and then they will get all the information associated with that bird. Some of the setbacks with bird banding is that the probability of recapturing this one individual is extremely low. Obviously, recaptures do happen, but if you think about it, the chances that same bird would fly into a net on one side of town compared to the other would be very low. But now when you're looking at a national level, that probability is even lower. They don't necessarily have to be recaptured to identify which bird it is. People can take pictures of the bird, and sometimes they do find them dead, but still the chances of getting that band combination is very low. Banding also has very little to no spatial accuracy, and that's because there aren't really any electronic components associated with the band. So if a bird was banded in Wisconsin and it's recaptured in Mississippi, for example, you know that that bird came from Wisconsin, but you don't know the route it took. You don't know the stopover habitat that it stayed. You don't know the duration it stayed at those important habitats. I'm not saying anything bad about banding. It definitely still has a place in ornithology, but that refined spatial information just isn't there with banding. Next, we're going to look at radar. I don't know a lot about radar, but I know that it is if it loads here, it's a relatively new technology that's used. A high density of birds are needed in order to show up on radar, which means that this method is not very good at individualized tracking. You can see here across the screen on the western side, you can kind of make out that this is Wisconsin. On the western side of the screen, you can see that these are weather systems, and on the northern part of the state as well. And these kind of bullseye blotches that are located throughout the state, these are the migratory movements that were taking place at that time. The reason why you can't track individuals with this is because birds are very small. And if everything that was the size of a bird could show up on radar, that screen would be a complete mess and you wouldn't be able to distinguish anything. But what radar is good for is that it indicates when there are large scale migration movements. A lot of towns and cities recently have requested that the people of the towns and the cities turn off lights during big migratory movements. A lot of times birds, when they're migrating, they see city lights, they see household lights, and they get disoriented. And a lot of times they crash into windows and they oftentimes die. So when movements are detected by radar, it can give people a good idea of when it might be wise to turn off those lights. Another useful thing that we can pull from these radar movements is we can see migratory corridors of large migration movements. We can see, again, when the migratory movements take place, and we can see these kind of really important areas and where they're lifting off from. Next, we'll move on to GPS transmitters. This is my favorite thing to talk about because the degree of spatial accuracy with GPS transmitters is very high. These are quite literally the best tool to use for any organism, but particularly birds and tracking wildlife. These specific units can be programmed to meet the researcher's needs. So, for example, if someone was tracking eastern whippoorwills, since that's primarily a nocturnal species, then they could program these transmitters to only transmit at night. On the other hand, if they wanted to see if whippoorwills were moving around during the day, then they could also have this transmitter read multiple times throughout the day as well to see if there have been any movements. This might be obvious, but local and long distance movements of birds can be tracked with GPS transmitters. I'll have a few examples of some different data analysis that we got from this project that I'll show you. This picture here is one of our American white pelicans in Green Bay. And you can see it does have a transmitter on its back. You can see the top of it is black, and that's because there's a solar panel there, meaning that they're designed to transmit for the duration of life of the bird. So as long as that solar panel is not obstructed by any dirt or debris or feathers, then the battery will theoretically recharge as long as there aren't any electronic problems, and that transmitter will continue transmitting for the entire life of the bird. I mentioned that we can look at data on a local and a large-scale movement basis of birds that are carrying transmitters. So I have a few maps here. They're a little bit small, so it might be hard to see. But when we look at the map on the left side of the screen, these are movements of about 20 American white pelicans on their journeys south to the wintering grounds. So you can see the areas that they look like they're basically etched into the map. Those are very heavily used areas by the pelicans that were carrying transmitters. Some do venture off on their own path. Some split off from those main veins, but a lot of overwintering here you can see took place in the southeastern parts of Texas, Louisiana, some in Florida, and then we even had some that were overwintering in Mexico as well. On the right, this is an example of those localized movements from data that we were able to pull, but these were from double-crested cormorants. So this map is a heat map that's consisting of 12 individual cormorants, And the heat map depicted here, red indicates a high density of the birds that are, or a high density of birds in that area, of cormorants in that area, and blue indicates a lesser density. Again, it's very hard to see, the map is zoomed out, but there are a lot of there are higher densities on Lake Butamore, the De Pere Dam. We also have Head Island Restoration Site, which was the breeding grounds. Longtail Point was a popular spot, and then we have some red also at the smaller islands in the northern portions of Green Bay. So outside of those island visits to northern Green Bay, you can see a lot of those points are constrained to southern Green Bay, which is interesting. And there weren't a lot of movements that went over to the main water body of Lake Michigan. One more thing that we can look at with these GPS transmitters is we can animate the points over time. So the maps I just showed you are great for presentations and great for research papers, but we can also look at how the bird moves over time by putting it into an animation. This video I'm about to show you here is of one American white pelican as it traveled south to its wintering grounds and then back north to the breeding grounds. You'll see 3 different colors represented on this map. You'll see a green line first, which indicates the fall 2022 migration, a pink line that indicates spring 2023 migration, and then an orange line that indicates fall 2023 migration. So I'll go ahead and play that now. See, there's the pink line there. And then there's the orange, and it follows a very similar path to its fall 2022 migration route. So really interesting data here. This bird is still actively transmitting. So we're looking forward to seeing where this bird comes through during this spring. So any day now it should start moving north, I would think.
That's only one bird?
One bird.
Huh.
And they definitely have the capabilities to fly over the Gulf, but we haven't really seen any of our transmitter birds that did that. They always fly over land. But it's interesting because it's known that songbirds do fly over the Gulf. They're obviously a lot smaller than a pelican, so it's very interesting. Now, we're going to take a step back, sort of, and talk about the specialized system for small migratory birds. And the reason why it's a step back is because the data that we get from the Motus wildlife tracking system isn't near as specialized or refined as what you would get from GPS transmitters. And so I'll start off by introducing the Motus wildlife tracking system here. This is from the Motus website. The Motus wildlife tracking system is an international collaborative research network that uses a coordinated automated radio telemetry array to track the movement and behavior of small flying animals. Now that's a mouthful, but it really isn't as complicated as it sounds. There are basically a couple main components here. So birds are tagged with a transmitter. The transmitter is in the upper right-hand corner, picture in the upper right-hand corner. It's very, very small. And when the bird flies within range of a Motus station, as you can kind of see in the lower right-hand picture, then the station logs the tag information from that bird and stores it on the site. I'll get into the details of that here coming up, but I just wanted to introduce that. So Motus station equipment, there are a few main components. The tags that are attached to songbirds are radio tags. So when we have radio tags, we need radio antennas to receive that frequency that the birds are carrying. So up at the top here, you can see this is a picture of 2 different types of Motus antennas. North America uses 2 main frequencies. The frequencies, they don't necessarily really mean anything to the regular public, but it's 434 megahertz and 166 megahertz. And so the bigger antennas are those 166 megahertz, and the smaller ones on the top are 434. And again, those antennas are listening to both different types of tags. So the antennas are then connected via coaxial cable to a receiving module. And that receiving module basically takes in the radio signals and it converts the radio signals into something digital that can be processed and that can be uploaded and analyzed for the detections. Now, these receiving modules have come a long way since Motus wireless tracking system began. And so any tag that gets detected by the antennas, these receiving modules can either store the information for the researcher to come and download the data, or they can be set up to upload data automatically to the Motus network for the public to view, for researchers to view, for anybody to view if there's a stable Wi-Fi connection or if there's an available cellular network connection. So very neat to be able to get up-to-date data with the Motus wireless tracking system. It limits time in the field for the researcher. Host sites can access the data quickly, and they won't be always asking, when are you going to come and download our data? So it uploads automatically. With a system like this, there of course needs to be a power source. If there is direct power available, then we just plug an AC adapter right into the wall. Otherwise, we need to go with an off-grid type system, and that consists of a deep cycle battery that's recharged with a solar panel. You can see up in this picture up here, kind of the top right, the leftmost one, that's our Washington Island station, and that has that off-grid type system because unfortunately there aren't any outlets in the middle of a grassland on Washington Island. The last piece of equipment that's needed is the mounting structure. When we're looking at different sites to host Motus stations, we would ideally prefer if there was a pre-existing structure that we could mount antennas to. This is because it greatly limits the amount of time needed to install the station, and it also saves money as well. The two pictures in the upper right corner are just a couple examples of the different types of mounting structures. The one on the left, the Washington Island station, that is a 10-foot tall tripod tower with a 20-foot telescoping mast, and that's just anchored with guy wires. And then the photo on the right, that's at Kingfisher Farm near Manitowoc. That's actually a light pole that's fastened to some anchor bolts that are in a concrete footing. So each Motus station is different. There aren't any two that are alike, and it kind of depends on what the site has available, what we need to bring in, kind of line of sight, how tall does the station have to be, or the tower have to be. A lot of different aspects come into play here, and that's why no two stations are exactly alike. So I kind of gave a little bit of information about the equipment. I'll talk a little bit now about the tags. As I mentioned with the antennas, there are two different frequencies used. Up in the upper right, you can see two different birds that are tagged with transmitters. Those are the two different types of tags, meaning that they have the different frequencies. So that's the only difference between the two. There are two different companies that makes these tags, and the one on the left is the higher frequency tag, and supposedly the tags have more combinations, more digital combinations, and there's less interference and less possible false detections with the tags. And the one on the right, those were kind of made first. There's a lot more potential noise that can interfere, and false detection rates are a little bit higher with that as well. The size of these Motus tags range from about 0.2 grams, even though they are being made smaller now. Every year their tags are being made smaller, to any size. But once you start getting into that minimum size of GPS transmitter, you might as well use GPS transmitter if the funds are available, just because the data set that you get is so much more robust with those GPS transmitters. These tags can be programmed to researchers' pulse needs. So what that means is that these transmitters, every so often, they send out a signal, and that signal, of course, is what is detected by the Motus station. The pulse, the program pulse kind of depends upon the researcher's question and what they're looking to answer. I'll give you an example here with, say a researcher is tagging ruby-throated hummingbirds. And they want to set the pulse rate to once a minute. Well, there might be a problem with that because as the tag pulses every minute, that's going to wear down the battery life of the tag extremely fast. And so if you want to track that bird over a very long distance, the battery might burn out before it completes its migration. On the other hand, if you want to really save battery and program the pulse rate to once every 10 minutes, well, that battery will last a really long time, but the bird might fly in and out of range of a station before it gets a chance to ping and the data gets collected. So there's kind of a cost benefit trade-off, and it all depends on what the researcher is studying and what their needs are. The Motus stations have a maximum detection range of about 12 miles. So it's really not that far. And that right there, 12 miles is probably the maximum. I'd say the average maximum range is 8 to 10 miles, I'd say. And a lot of that has to do with how much interference and noise there is, environmental noise. So for example, if you're looking at establishing a Motus station near an airport or near a generating station, that's going to create a lot of noise, and that's going to greatly limit the range of your Motus station. I'll kind of go over, this is a general kind of vague outline of what we use to establish Motus stations and what a lot of other researchers might use to establish Motus stations. The first step is, and by far the most important, is establishing partnerships. None of this would be possible without partners, because these stations, as I mentioned, have a very short detection range. So a lot of these stations need to be put up in order to cover a large area. So not everybody owns all the land around. And so whenever we're looking at placing a station, we need to reach out to a potential partner to see if they'd be willing to at least place a station. And all we need first off is to get their agreement to host the station. Sometimes the host does have funding available. Sometimes we have to search for that ourselves, but that's the next step in getting receivers, Motus stations actually established, is looking for that funding. Once we get the funding and a plan together to install a Motus station and kind of meet the needs of the host, then we can start establishing those transects. Now, transects are a great way to ensure coverage while also minimizing the cost. We're looking at creating these invisible fences across important areas. So for example, along major waterways or along or across a state like Wisconsin from east to west. And that just will ensure that a bird that's tagged, the probability of it not getting detected would be very low. After a number of receivers are put in place, we are then looking to start tagging projects. The tags have to be connected to a very specific scientific question before anything can be deployed. So someone can't just say, well, I want to tag blue-winged warblers one day and some Blackbirdian warblers or something the next. They have to have a very specific question, very specific research goals in mind before they can even get the tags and to be approved by the bird banding lab. Once the scientific question is proposed and they get to go ahead and start tagging birds, especially trained bander is needed to apply the tags to the birds, because of course it requires a lot of finesse and a lot of experience to put a little transmitter on a bird. You can see the bird up here in the upper right hand corner is holding one of those transmitters, and like I said, a lot of finesse and a lot of finagling is needed to get that transmitter on there. These specially trained banders also need to adhere to permissions at the local and federal level in order to successfully and legally complete these projects. I'll throw a few numbers at you guys here. This slide from Motus was made a few months ago, so inevitably a lot of these numbers are higher now. But Motus stations are currently in 5 continents, 34 countries within those continents. There are most certainly now over 1,500 Motus receiver stations that are active. 312 species have been tagged and nearly 40,000 animals tagged within those species. Now there's probably over 600 projects involving Motus, 1,732 Motus partners and collaborators, and 173 publications that have come from Motus so far. Like I said, a lot of these numbers are going to be higher, but just to give you the reach of Motus and all of its possibilities. These next 3 slides are going to be screenshots from the Motus Wildlife Tracking System website, and the yellow dots indicate active receivers. So as you can see at the continental level, North America has most receiving stations by far, or Motus stations by far, although there are some popping up here in other continents. If we zoom into North America, you can see that southeastern Canada and the northeastern United States, it looks like a minefield. There's so many yellow dots over there, but they've really done a good job of installing these Motus stations. As you drift further to the west, there are fewer Motus stations, and that's just because there are less inhabitants, and there are also geographical barriers such as mountain ranges as you really move far to the west. Zooming in on Wisconsin, a more local look, this map, you can see that there are a lot of holes in Wisconsin yet, but we're getting there. This map looks a lot better now than it did at this time last year. We were able to install 16 Motus stations last year throughout Wisconsin. Most of those were along Green Bay and the main water body of Lake Michigan. And that was thanks to a Sustain Our Great Lakes grant that funded 16 stations along there. We also collaborated with some other partners to help them install stations as well. One being Bob Welch's station at the Wapaka Biological Field Station, and also 2 Motus stations near Eau Claire at Beaver Creek Reserve. I'll talk a little bit about our current project along Lake Michigan here coming up in the next few slides. But first, as I mentioned, this is just a depiction here from the Midwest Migration Network, and this shows the transects that are proposed to be in place by 2030. So this is a little bit of a reach, I would think, especially along the Mississippi, but we are already making a lot of headway, especially along the Lake Michigan basin, and also beginning our expansion westward across the state as well. So you can see that all these orange dots, this was made a few years ago, all these orange dots were proposed stations, but now almost all of those are yellow because those are active stations. This line here in Illinois is actually shifted more up towards the border, and we have some collaborators or some people that we collaborate with that have one more station left to put up in this transect of stations that's now along the border, and I'm actually going down next week to help them establish that final station. So establishing these transects ensures maximum amount of coverage while also saving some funding. Stations do cost anywhere between $3,000 to $5,500, so fairly expensive. It can cost even more than that if some extra expertise is needed, say certified electrician is needed. The cost can go up pretty fast after that. When we zoom into Wisconsin here, you can see a better look at what our plan is. I already talked about that Illinois borderline and one remaining station that's left there. These lines are more linear than what are actually going to be the case, but this just gives a good representation of kind of where those lines are proposed to be set up. The current project that I've been working on ever since I started my role at Lake Michigan Bird Observatory has been this Lake Michigan project. As I mentioned before, the project has been funded by a Sustain Our Great Lakes grant, and this includes funding for 16 Motus stations along the Lake Michigan basin. We installed 13 of these stations last year, meaning there are only 3 left to be installed. One is up in Marinette, the other is at the new zoo, and then we have one more that's going up on the Oneida Reservation this year. So once that's complete, then the Motus stations will all be set up for this grant. This next image just gives you a more direct look at the different sites that these Motus stations have been and are going to be installed at. Along with Motus, we're also doing a lot of native plantings at each of these sites too. So it's not just restricted to Motus. There are a lot of benefits that are coming from this grant outside of Motus. And then lastly, I'll give a brief timeline of our project here along Lake Michigan. 2023 is obviously gone, but one of the objectives there was to install the majority of those Lake Michigan receivers by the end of the year, and that was completed. So this year we're looking to install the remaining number of those receivers. Plantings were a little bit behind schedule last year, but we're catching up this year and doing most of the plantings, and we'll finish that next year as well. Next year, after we install the remaining number of stations, we're looking at tagging some species of birds to contribute to Motus in that way. We're not exactly sure what species we're going to be tagging yet, but we're exploring a few options, and things are looking pretty good for tagging birds next year. As always, with these projects, we will be beginning and continuing education work. That's a big part of these grant objectives and just objectives in general. And most importantly, in all these years, we'll be supporting our partners in any way we can, because none of this would be possible without them. Now, this ends my PowerPoint presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition to the Motus website and just show how that can be navigated in a bit. I know I threw a lot of information at you guys here with different methods, but I am open for any questions you might have. So I will transition to that right now. You can ask any questions that you might have. Can't see the top, so I'm going to be navigating with the screen on a delay here, so it's going to be a little tricky. All right, so the Motus Wildlife Tracking System can be accessed by simply typing motus.org up in the toolbar. And what's cool about this is that anybody can access tag detection information. So what we can do is we can scroll down here. And what we see here is just a mess of yellow on the map. But if we zoom in, we can focus more on Wisconsin, since we are in Wisconsin. This seems like a likely thing to do. Now, if we're looking at accessing data from a specific station and we know the station that we want to access the data from, we can go ahead and click any of these yellow dots. So I know this one at Forest Beach Migratory Bird Preserve has been a really productive station. So we'll go ahead and click on that one. And when this list pops up, you'll see a bunch of different information. You'll see when the station was deployed. You'll see when the last data was received from the station. But what we're really after here is looking at the tags detected row. So next to the number, you can see that 29 birds have been detected by the station since it was deployed. So over about 5 years, 29 birds have been detected. We can go ahead and click on table. Scrolling down, this will give a list of every single bird that was detected. So on the left, we'll see the detection date of the specific bird. We'll see the project that it's associated with. We'll see the species, the date that tag was deployed on the bird itself, and the location that the bird was tagged in. So we get a lot of Swainson's thrushes that come through Wisconsin, especially in the fall. And it seems to be our most popular bird that gets detected by our stations. So we'll click down here. So this is a recent example. We have 2 birds that came through in early October of 2023 by this Forest Beach Migratory Bird Preserve Motus station. And you can see, interestingly, they came 3 days apart, but they were tagged on the same day. And where they were tagged might be kind of surprising to all of you, but we'll go ahead and click on the bird itself. And then we will go up to a map to show the detections over a map. You can see that this bird was tagged near Vancouver. And it made this big journey. At each dot that you see here is Motus station that the bird was detected by. So it was tagged in Vancouver, and it made this journey all the way east. As soon as it hit Lake Michigan, it went down and almost straight down from Lake Michigan, a little bit more to the east. But this bird presumably overwintered down here in southern Central America. So very cool down here near Costa Rica. So if we go back, we can look at the thrush that was detected just 3 days later. We can look at that in a map as well. And we can see very similar behavior out of this bird. This is very common for these birds. A lot of the tracks indicate this, where they kind of have this big dog-legging migratory route. And it looks like it wintered in a very similar spot as well. I'll share one more Swainson's thrush. I don't want to keep sharing just one species of birds, but they really have some interesting behavior. This last fall, we also had a bird that was detected here in Kenosha. So this is a relatively new station. I installed the station on August 17th, and we had 2 birds that got detected, both of which were also Swainson's thrushes. You can see that one of these birds, the tag was deployed in August of 2022, and one was deployed in August of 2023. We'll look at this August 2022 one, and we know this one's going to have good data because it's been around for almost 2 years now. So we'll go ahead and look at this. I'll give you an example of a false detection, and we'll also see the journey that this bird took. So this here is likely, well, almost certainly a false detection. So there is some interference of some sort that mimicked the radio signal of this tag. So we'll kind of throw that one out, but you can see that this bird has taken this migratory journey multiple times. And I believe this is its spring migration back up to the breeding grounds. So all these birds that seem to be tagged in or near Vancouver all take a very, very similar route south to the wintering grounds. Another thing you can do too is you can see where each bird where it was detected at each station, and then there's a little arrow here that you can play an animation. Sometimes this doesn't give a good representation, because if the bird spends a lot of time in one area and then a very short time migrating, the arrow goes really fast and the pace is all over the place. But I'll show you here how this works. You can see the route here. I don't know if it'll show up well on the screen. Yeah, it's kind of skipping, but it shows up a lot better here on the computer. And if you were to look at that as well, you will be able to see that. I forget the exact number of birds total that our stations have detected over the years, but as I mentioned, a lot of these stations that you see here in Wisconsin, a lot of them are brand new. So most of these Lake Michigan stations, most of these are new. The Wapaka station and Beaver Creek Reserve stations are new. A lot of these are new stations, so I'm really excited to see the birds that might get detected by these stations in the coming years. So that kind of ends my presentation. I'm sure there are questions. I kind of rambled and rifled through some topics that aren't really familiar to a lot of people. So I'm willing to answer any questions you might have.
How is the transmitter attached to the bird?
It's usually attached with a material called stretch magic. There's stretch magic, and then there's like a tubular Teflon that some people use. It's kind of like a stretchy thread, and there's a kind of a figure 8 harness that goes around the legs and through the wings of the bird.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You said the receivers have about realistically a 10-mile range.
Yeah.
So that would mean you would want to have them, what, 20 miles apart or thereabouts?
Yes.
I mean, even your plan isn't showing anywhere near that,
Well,
but, or is it more you kind of know where the birds are going a little bit already?
well, it's known that a lot of birds follow Lake Michigan, for example, as a migratory corridor. So you don't necessarily need all those stations along Lake Michigan every 20 miles apart or so. That's a good point that I forgot to mention as well, that the antennas on the stations are directional, meaning that they don't have any receiving capabilities behind them. So yes, or they do, but it's very, very little. They're not omnidirectional antennas. So presumably you'd like to have one antenna on one station facing another antenna on the other station to kind of bridge that gap. But what you're talking about, I'll slide over. You can see that even though a lot of these stations are 20 miles or more than 20 miles apart, for example, there's just so many of them.
Yeah.
That, you know, if a bird flies through, it's most likely going to be detected by one of them. And the other thing I'll mention too, even though we're trying to establish stations in transects, we still won't discourage anybody from if they want a Motus station, and if they want to fund a Motus station, we're not going to discourage any of that either, just because even though they might not be contributing to a transect, it's still of value, and they can still detect birds. And just looking at how that station might link up to other stations will help tell the story of that bird as it travels.
So does each station typically have 2 antennas, sort of one's facing east and one's facing west, for instance?
What we like to do is, with the 2 different types of antennas that we have, we like to put 3 of the 166 megahertz antennas on the stations. We try to position those at about 120 degrees apart. And that'll give a general, not quite 360 coverage, because there will be holes on the outer edge of that range, but that'll kind of cover the whole thing. And then with the 434 megahertz, we point those at the direction of hopefully whatever station is next in line. So whether if the station's northeast of us, then we'll point it northeast and have the other ones point southwest. The reason why we have 3 and 2 is for a while, the tags that were the most abundant were those 166 megahertz tags, but now it's more equal. And in fact, the 434 megahertz tags are a little bit more popular. However, the birds that seem to travel through our neck of the woods, a lot of them are still carrying those 166. So it's kind of dependent on what area you're in, what types of birds are carrying what types of tags, and where they're expected to be traveling.
So if somebody's interested in being a host for a tower, what do they need to do in terms of reaching out to you or Motus in general?
Yeah.
Obviously funding, you said some people will fund their own.
Yeah.
Where does funding from you guys come from?
So, the first thing to do, reaching out to me would be a good idea. And, Motus really, it's a Birds Canada organization. And even though they kind of keep up the website, they're not very good at responding to emails and giving you good ideas on who you might be able to contact. They have some documents on how you could set up stations and stuff like that, but they don't really have good contacts. And so in Wisconsin, we by far have the most stations in the state. There are a couple others that have stations as well, but our Lake Michigan Bird Observatory is really the only organization right now that's working in Wisconsin setting up these stations. So if you were interested in hosting a station and you'd reach out to me, I'd see what you as an organization might have available for funding. I'd see what we might be able to have available for funding. That might depend from year to year on what grants we have received and what we're able to contribute. If we can't contribute anything out of grants that we may already have, then we would explore opportunities, for example, pursue other donors. We might look for somebody who would want to sponsor a station at your location. And then we also might apply for a specific grant. Sometimes counties have grants available for STEM research. Sometimes schools do, things like that. So we would explore all those options.
You said range of price is usually around like 2,000 to 5,000.
Generally, it's between 3,000 and 5,500. If you're using an off-grid type system, then you have to buy the battery, which is like close to $300. The solar panels over $100. All the extra cables, so it's a little more expensive. An AC adapter is only like, I don't know, $25. So it's just so much easier to plug that thing into the wall. Another thing is, if the station is at a site that has a stable Wi-Fi connection, there's no extra cost. But of course, if we have to connect to the cell network, that's usually I'd say about $60 extra a year. But that's not really necessary either. If you really want to go the old-fashioned way of just having someone come out and download the data, that's free as well. But it's definitely not as intriguing as seeing those live pulses. Is what's kind of cool is I have a habit of checking the stations online frequently, and this station here at Thousand Islands in Appleton, or not Appleton, in Kakana, if it loads here, I have a little bit of a unstable internet connection. Not loading, but just recently the Thousand Island station detected a saw-whet owl that was tagged in Illinois. And it detected that on 313. So just a week ago, it detected that bird. Here we go. You can see if we click on that, we can get the species and we can get the project. Click on that. So what I'm getting at is that it's really cool to have this thing sort of live updating. It's really exciting for the host and then also people managing the station. They can see kind of what their station is doing at the current moment.
Do the antennas themselves, let's say you were to put it not super far from your house or whatever, is there a lot of like conflict with sometimes people's Wi-Fi or their connection, or?
Not that we've known of so far.
So
No,
having it nearby a house would be fine enough.
yeah, as far as
Layout.
we know, yeah, we haven't really had any problems with that. There were a couple locations where there were other communications and the site was a little bit concerned about that, but we haven't detected any problems.
A variation of that question. there's all sorts of speculation, research on the effect on human beings, radio waves, cell phones, all these sorts of things. There may be even some medical consequences to these things for humans. Any speculation, any way of studying what the impact on the birds is for all this interference?
That's interesting. I am not aware of any studies that are going on with that right now. I thought you were gonna ask if there is anything with the antennas affecting humans, like the antennas.
No, I don't think what it does.
But I was gonna say those are receive only antennas. So, but yeah, the birds itself, I don't know. Obviously a songbird can live 9-10 years or so. So I don't know if they live long enough to be able to be drastically affected, but that's also interesting. I don't know if you would think that potentially it could, maybe not, but potentially if you're thinking about it, they could be impacted by migration and the different magnetic fields that they use. But I don't know, I'm not aware of any studies that research that. Yeah.
Question. What are some of the more ideal locations, in terms of terrain? Or if it's in an urban area, would you put it on top of a tall building? Hills, or do you want it more out in open fields or in wooded areas?
Yeah, so ideally, we want to have a line of sight as far as the eye can see, because anything that's obstructing the station isn't going to be good for it. So if there are trees that are nearby, that's going to affect the capability of the antenna to receive the signal. There's a large hill nearby. That's another thing to consider, and we potentially put it on top of the hill just to get that nice overlooking location on the landscape. Now, a thing to consider, I briefly mentioned it as well, but we haven't analyzed this a lot. I know a lot of other researchers do, but one thing to consider is the amount of noise that's in a specific area. We're looking at getting a device that monitors noise, the noise, so that we can determine if this is a good site to place the station at, because that noise does limit the reception of the station as well. So for example, if that station was located near an airport, or if it was located near a generating plant, those are locations that generate a lot of just noise, electromagnetic noise, and that can really mess with the station. Not in a dangerous way, but just it affects its receptive capabilities.
So on one of the slides, looks like you guys have these on monarch butterflies, or what other non-avian species?
Yeah,
are you
so
using this with?
I know people have done studies on turtles. Monarchs, they don't usually use those tags you see on birds just because they're so heavy, but they do have miniaturized versions of those. I know my advisor from UW Green Bay, she puts those tags on bumblebees. Yeah, and it's not tracking migratory movements, but it's tracking the nest locations of queens and where they're flying to and from. So it's interesting to see a bee carrying a pretty large transmitter around.
Can you see all that data on the website as well, or is it just?
That we can, because that's actually not affiliated with Motus. The tags are very similar, but what low tech, the tag manufacturer, does for projects like that, it associates, or it kind of assigns a separate frequency for those projects, just because they're not really going to be flying by Motus stations. So they kind of, I don't want to say that they just shrug them off, but they just kind of keep them out of that Motus frequency.
Are there a lot of stations in Canada?
Lots in Canada. I'll go back here. I'll zoom in. You can see that, especially around Ontario, there are quite a few stations here along Lake Erie. That's kind of where they're centrally located. They're in kind of blotches throughout Canada, but there are a lot of research projects that are going on in this area, and there are a lot more stations here that meets the eye. I mean, it does look like a lot, but there are a lot more there than it looks. Once you start adding up those yellow dots, it's quite a few. And of course, in western part of Canada as well. There are quite a few, especially in British Columbia. It's interesting though, because when you look at these kind of random stations in the middle of nowhere, it's interesting that a tagged bird flies by those locations, because you would think like, what are the chances that it does that? But again, as opposed to banding, even though the detection range is pretty small from these stations, it's still a lot more of a detection range than what a little bird would have to fly through the net of a bander to see where that bird has been.
There was a question online, in the chat.
Oh, was it?
Yeah,
Okay.
can you look at the chat? I was just gonna
Sure.
say.
Okay. We had white pelicans at Lake by summer. If those birds were tagged, would we be able to tell from the Motus website if white pelicans were tracked? So if those birds were tagged, it would be kind of difficult to. It would be kind of difficult to know which individual was tagged. So if you know that these birds were hanging out near a Motus station, then you could click on the Motus station that's nearest to where those pelicans were hanging out, and then you could see if a pelican was detected, and then you would know that way. But I'm not aware of any pelicans that are tagged with Motus transmitters, just because they're so big. A lot of researchers use the GPS transmitters on those. But yes, if there were tagged pelicans with Motus tags, you'd be able to see it if you knew they were located near the station.
Any other questions?
Are there things other than birds that are on the same Motus site? If you go out there, will it show up bats or something else?
Bats, yes, I'm certain there are bats that have been detected. I don't know about insects. There are probably a few detections across the stations throughout North America, but there are definitely bat detections on there.
And they'll be on that same site.
Yes. Yeah, if you click on, it'll be under the same heading as the tags received. If you click on table, you'll see like big brown bat or hoary bat or something, for example. And those lists are listed chronologically. It's not by species or anything. So you go through and you'd be able to see the bat.
It doesn't do large mammals like elk or something like that, though.
So, there might be those radio transmitters that those often have their own frequency, and a lot of people track those on the ground. So that's a little, they do use similar technology, but it's a little bit different.
Well, thank you, Jacob, so much. Thanks for helping us figure out the thing. I was thinking back there, once I relaxed, it came to me that if you took your thumb drive, that's actually the computer back there, and put it in the USB port there, I think it would have projected here,
Well-
but this worked too?
Well, the reason why I used that was just because
Yeah.
I couldn't share the screen properly on this
Yeah.
one. So since this computer was technically the host, then I was able to do
Yeah.
it. But I
Doesn't
mean,
matter.
plugging that into the HDMI worked just fine too. I just couldn't share the screen.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And we have some things coming up in April. On April 20th, it's Sunrise on the Buena Vista field trip. So that's why something to look forward to. Rob Pendergast is going to lead that trip. And on April 17th, our program here at 7 p.m. is Protecting the Whooping Crane with Stephanie Schmidt, her name is. So she's associated with NICETA and also with International Crane Foundation. So, there you go. Thank you all for coming.
We have treats and stuff.
And who brought treats tonight?
Yeah, don't forget.
Ned and.
Yeah.
Oh,
Jan, and Jan.
Thank you.
And Jan brought the drinks.
Oh, and Jan brought, thank you so much. So, get a little something to sip on.
I didn't want to put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
If any of us remember.
Oh, no, I must have done it.
Well,